we took
Do you have
the,
anybody that was like,
yeah,
no way, no
yeah.
way?
Well, it was a little,
Well, I didn't know that's
it was a stretch. It was a stretch for me when I do that, just clambering up that thing and,
Grabbing
you
onto
remember that,
the.
don't you?
Oh, yeah. I didn't recognize the Alpine Meadow, and so I actually took my entire class all the way to the very top.
Yeah.
I don't think it was recommended, but everybody loved it.
It's a big moment, and it's kind of related to this. The videographer across the fence came with him. He was like, he was curious.
Doing some of those big steps over the this.
I understand.
You'll appreciate it. I'll send you this video that we actually had a perfect moment where the new UVM electric bus was here to pick the students up. Drove them up, the gondola, took the gondola, they hiked up, fell back for 4 hours.
Welcome, everybody. Sorry. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, who is Mark Kisselhart from the UVM Extension Service. He's our Maple Extension Specialist. He is the only Maple Extension Specialist in the state of Vermont, which means he is answering everybody's questions about how to do everything, creates a whole set of how-to YouTube videos from everything from food safety to sustainable tapping to off flavors and what happens, how do you get them, how do you avoid them, and what do they taste like. And has been working in maple for many years. His undergraduate degree is here at UVM in forestry, and then did a master's in plant biology, and has fortunately been working in this field ever since. Mark talks to communities across the state, across New England, all the time via all different kinds of media. And so we are just another one of his interested audiences. So please welcome Mark.
Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Maple is a unique product, and I'm going to go through some just very basics about what maple is, maybe some things that you hadn't thought about before, sprinkle in a little bit of research that I've done or collaborated with others on, and just try to give you a feel for kind of the breadth of the work that I do through what's called the UVM Extension Maple Program. I am based out of the Proctor Maple Research Center, which is part of plant biology. We're in Underhill, about 40 minutes or so from here, depending on traffic. But I work statewide as well as internationally, so producers from all over are free to ask questions. That's my main audience, but I also talk with people who are just curious about maple, the media. I get a lot of media. And just to kind of frame the maple program, there are 3 big buckets that I try to focus on. That would be sugar bush health and management. So what are the key drivers to keeping the resource healthy and productive in terms of producing sap and syrup? The other one is sustainable high yields. So the high yields is really important to producers, maximizing how much sap they get every year, but understanding that there may be a limitation to how much we can take out. We don't know. That's kind of I'll just spoil it right now. We don't know significantly how much we take out in terms of the tree's total non-structural carbohydrates. I'll just get that out there right now. But it is something that we need to think about, because as I'll lay out, technology for this very traditional product has changed dramatically over the last 25 years. And so what was seen as sustainable in the past, there's no guarantee that what modern techniques are will be considered sustainable as well. And the last one is syrup quality. And syrup quality relates to, like Gene says, when there's a defect or something wrong with the flavor, or it could be some other attribute around the product as it is defined as being high quality and grade A. I'll talk a little bit about some research I'm doing in that. Has anyone here done maple syrup production, either in the backyard or a large operation too? Okay. So some of this might be review to Stephen Walt, but we'll get through it. And the other thing I want to say is that as part of my work with the Maple program, I'll do original research, but also adapt other folks' research that seems relevant to the main audiences, which typically is maple producers, but not always. And really, for something that's so traditional, there can be a lot of folk wisdom around the production of this that isn't really rooted in science. And so really try to have a foundation where that's where the information coming out is rooted in something that is science-based rather than what you were told by someone and so on. If you're interested in more information about the Maple program, I do maintain a website. It has a bunch of different materials, little short bites, and also really deep dives, whole length presentations from our Maple conferences. So feel free to check that out. Okay, so now the background. Maple sugaring. You probably, if you're living full-time or just during the school year in Vermont, you've probably heard of this, probably familiar with it, at least that it comes from a tree. Hopefully, if you're in this room, you understand it comes from a tree. It is also an interesting mix between agriculture and forestry and food production. And the distinction may seem a little academic, but it does have real implications in terms of where the knowledge comes from and who's doing the research and how we got to where we are in 2024 in terms of production. So I want to lay that out a little bit. Really basic, you have to have a dormant tree. We're not tapping trees with the leaves on. And we're talking specifically about members of the genus Acer. You can tap other members of other genuses, but we're talking just about maple today. The other sort of academic distinction, but I do think it's important that maple sap and therefore maple syrup is a non-timber forest product. And by that, we mean we're harvesting something from the plant. We're not harvesting the plant itself. And that has implications from sustainability through management, all sorts of different implications, because we're not growing this plant for the clearest, straightest saw log. We're growing it to harvest this liquid, this maple sap every year. And so the management could be different and likely is different based on that fact. It's not just the same type of forestry you might apply for growing logs or some other forest product. So the raw sap is what we harvest from the woods, and depending, it gets even more complicated because the raw sap is considered a purely agricultural product. And depending on who's in charge of regulating, there may be a forestry connection too, as far as who oversees the best practices in the woods, if they're enrolled in some sort of third-party certification or some sort of tax abatement program that may fall under forestry rather than agriculture. A lot of this just comes up from the fact that historically this was a part of farm production in a time when we had broadly distributed agricultural production across the landscape. But right now, 2024, we have this mix of agriculture and forestry happening in the woods. And then you have this whole other activity happening in what we call the sugar house. That's where you transform that raw sap, that's roughly 2% sugar, into this extremely valuable, high quality food product called maple syrup, which is roughly 67% sugar. Now you're dealing with all the issues related to food safety. You're dealing with precise measurements of density of a liquid. You're dealing with boiling point of liquids and all sorts of complex reactions happening in the evaporator. Those are all things that, again, all of these things deserve more research, but it is fundamentally different than what's happening in the woods. We're taking this raw product and we're converting it into this highly valued product. It's also really important to understand, this is a basic thing that maybe you haven't thought about, but maple sap is not just really thin maple syrup. It's fundamentally something different, and it isn't until that raw sap gets exposed to high temperatures and all the complex reactions that go on between the sugars in the sap, the amino acids, all the minerals, and all those other flavor precursors that we create the color and flavor that we associate with pure maple syrup. So maple syrup, different than maple sap, but obviously closely related. The production practices have changed dramatically over time. Humans have been harvesting sap from dormant maple trees since before Europeans arrived. There is a rich tradition of that. It's largely laid down in an oral history. And so I'm not going to talk about the earliest humans who produced that product. I know that there are stories that you can seek out and hear about, and I would encourage you to do that. The practices, the process, the equipment has changed dramatically. The use of thin metal vessels has allowed for a more efficient evaporation. And now we have even more high technology that allows this product to be made. But fundamentally, we're still talking about this very short period of time during the late winter, early spring, where we're harvesting this very dilute sugar sap coming from the tree. And we're converting it to this thick, colorful, flavorful syrup as a result of atmospheric boiling using heat. And that's fundamentally the way things have changed. What's interesting to note is that, especially during the period of a lot of diverse farms across the landscape, we produced a lot of syrup in Vermont and elsewhere. There was a strongly agrarian economy, small farms, but broadly distributed across the landscape, each making a small amount of syrup for their own use, but also a little bit for market sales. I'm talking late 1800s, early 1900s. The product at that point was not syrup, it was hard sugar. Hard sugar has a very low water activity level. It's easier to store. We're talking about times when there wasn't refrigeration. So if you ever wondered why it's called the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association, it's because sugar was the product, the finished product, not syrup. Technology and tastes and all that has changed. So now that syrup is by far the dominant product that's sold, and syrup is still available, but on a much smaller scale. As we saw a very strong and precipitous decline in the number of farms in Vermont and elsewhere, we saw maple production drop as well. So this next slide shows you the production just in Vermont over the last 100 years. And what you can see is a strong decline in that early period, the first part of that 100 years. And that can really be explained by consolidation of farms, abandonment of farms, just a change from what had been to a more manufacturing-based economy and other types of ways of earning a living. I will point out, just because it relates to the discussion later about climate, look how volatile production was 100 years ago. You know, that volatility really reflects how critically important the weather is during that 6 to 8 week season. That weather that we sort of characterize as freezing nights and above freezing days, 1 or 2 of those days, either plus or minus, meaning you have them or you don't have them, can make a difference in the overall production when you're thinking about a relatively short period of time. It's not like some other crops where you have a whole growing season to maybe overcome a low water period or high temperatures or some other things that might affect production. It's all condensed in that 6 to 8 week period. So we had this decline, and then we had this period where production was pretty stable, but at a low level. That baseline was really reflected by people and families who produced syrup before. They were in it to do it forever, essentially. They were passing it down between generations. And that will also say that in the late 60s, early 70s, we did have an influence of the sort of the back to land movement, you might call, where there were people moving to Vermont who were interested in a more internet connection to the landscape. And they did start making maple. And a lot of those folks are still producing today and have passed it on to their family. So it's not just the multi-generational maple producers in Vermont that have kept the industry going, although that's an important part, but we have others entering the industry and continuing that tradition. The other thing I want to point out, hopefully everyone can see this is not a static graph. There's a lot of dynamism, I guess you'd say here. Huge period of growth in production in Vermont. And I'm not gonna, I could spend a whole hour on why that is. But suffice to say, consumer demand for less processed sweeteners is one driving demand. The way in which the Quebec system influences the overall system has a role to play. Quebec is a supply management, highly regulated supply management system, and they have 70% of market share in production. So essentially, when times are good, and the value of syrup relative to the Canadian syrup is good. We see a lot of growth in places like Vermont. So, but still some volatility, especially during these last couple of years. And I'll talk a little bit about that. A lot to digest. Happy to talk about it in more detail if you want. And why am I just talking about Vermont? I probably should have led with this, but Vermont produces over half the US production of syrup. So this past year, we were over 3 million gallons of syrup just in the state of Vermont. And that's way, way above the production in other states. If you add New York and Maine, you get about 80% of the US crop just in those 3 states. So although there's a rich tradition and very passionate maple producers in other parts of the state, the driving force of the crop is overwhelmingly weighted towards Vermont, New York, and Maine. And that has implications as to where the syrup is marketed and how it's marketed and various things. But like I said, other places have maple trees too. This is just looking at basal area of sugar maple. We know we tap more than just sugar maple. Darker blobs are a higher amount basal area. You know, there are more tappable trees in northern Wisconsin, Michigan, New York than there are in Vermont. And they do have the climate that can promote in sap flow and good amounts of sap flow. There's perhaps a stronger tradition of other forest products in those areas, in those same areas. So Vermont has a very strong maple tradition, and that continues today. These other states are getting into it, and they always have produced maple, but on that larger scale, we're seeing more growth in some of those other states as well. Especially with volatility of log prices and other alternative uses for those stands. Yeah.
Just while you're on the top, I was curious about New Hampshire. I wasn't sure if that showed up in your.
It's like 1%.
It's so amazing to me.
Yeah.
I mean, is it?
Very different geology.
Is that a big part of it? The different geology?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although they have a rich tradition of making maple syrup. It just doesn't. And I don't want to set things up to say, just because you make a lot, you're more important than you don't make a lot. There's a rich tradition in New Hampshire and other places.
Yeah.
But as far as how they contribute to the annual crop, it's a small amount. So you have the climate, you have the resource, but you also have the knowledge and the tradition and the willingness to get out there during this can be a difficult time of year, weather-wise, to really do the work to harvest this sap. So Vermont leads the way, but there's potential in other areas as well. Just to illustrate that kind of decline or change, I should say, in how syrup was made. 100 years ago, we had thousands and thousands of small farms in the US reporting maple production, but the average number of taps was a couple hundred. Whereas today, this is actually Vermont numbers, I should say. We have 1,400 producers in Vermont reporting to the USDA with over 3,000 taps as an average. So we've seen growth in production, and that growth has largely been rooted in larger operations. And that reflects that kind of departure from what we would consider a more traditional form, where you have buckets and maybe horses, and you had however many buckets you can handle. That's how big your operation is going to be. It's really hard to do 3,000 buckets. People do it, but it's a lot of labor. And since labor is the number one limiting factor in terms of production and growth in maple, like in other areas of the economy, it's really hard to get people to, maybe for a day or two, but it's hard to have them come back after maybe a week of hauling sap. It's a lot of work. So modern technology with tubing and vacuum has definitely allowed growth to take place, especially considering all the savings in terms of demand on labor. I'll also say that size does matter, and what we see is an unequal amount of yield. These bars represent the average production of syrup per tap at different sized operations. So the smallest that the USDA records is 1 to 99 taps. And then it goes up. The breakpoints are a little odd. This is what the USDA uses, so I'm going with it. But 1 to 99 taps, 100 to 400, and so on. the larger the operation, you can see the trend, the higher average yield, like total syrup divided by total taps. That's how you get yield. It's absolutely the highest in the largest operations. That can be explained by, again, a bigger operation, bringing in more money, can probably invest in more modern technology, higher, now we use technology to remotely sense where vacuum leaks are in the tubing system, all these things that can promote greater production. One interesting thing, in talking to the person I know at USDA who follows this, asked them about this weird little blip, like why are the 1 to 99 tappers doing better than the 100 to 499? And he said, it's interesting. We see that same pattern, this sort of dip and then increasing yield, basically in every crop that we report. And this represents sort of the hobby. Like you got one row of peas and you really like peas. You're going to take a lot of those dips, you know, and they're going to be the best. You're going to get the most yield. No bug is going to touch your peas. So it's going to be a similar thing with 1 to 99 taps. And then once you get to grow up, like, oh, okay. Maybe getting 1,000 gallons of sap a day is going to be hard for me to handle. And that's when we start to see yields drop and other things. Last thing I'll say, and this is looking at yield. I apologize for the dates, a little confusing here, but you can see it's 2001 to 2024. This represents Vermont average yield each year, and then the US average yield each year. So this is across all size classes. There's a general positive trend. I think we can all agree there's some volatility, but the yield is increasing over time. But it's definitely not a straight line. We're bumping along, and there's some events that cause production to drop. Does anyone know what happened in 2012 that would cause this? Yeah.
Was it one of the hurricanes?
No, wasn't a hurricane. I'll say this is happened during, this is an event that happened during the actual maple season.
Oh, was that one of the big ice storms?
Yeah.
No?
No.
Dang, we thought we had.
Any other guesses? So if you look back, and this was actually notable beyond just maple, but if you look back in March of 2012, we had 5 days in the mid to upper 70s in Vermont and elsewhere. There was some polar thing, I'm not a climate scientist, but there was some polar thing that put a lot of high pressure across much of the northern US, sustained hot temperatures. I'll tell you how it affected it in a minute, but high temperatures during the season can really affect production. We saw a little bit of that in 2021, not the same magnitude and not as widespread, but it still affected the yield and the production. But we also can have years like 2023 where it was too cold for much of the season. We had a little bit of run in the beginning, and then it got cold, and it was cold in the area where most of the taps are in Vermont. The northern half of the state was very cold. And then, you know, the spring is coming. It just got too warm too fast at the end at a more typical time. And there was no time to recover in terms of production. So too warm, definitely a huge concern. Too cold is also an issue because sap won't run when it's frozen. At a very small scale, I want to point out this is a project that I do every year. It's called the Vermont Maple Bulletin. It's self-reported. I have about 30 producers who follow the same 10-question survey every year. Every week or so, they get sent the same questions. One of them is, how close to your anticipated total are you? In other words, if you anticipate making 1,000 gallons of syrup a year based on your taps and what you've done in the past, how close to that 1,000 gallons are you? And then they report each week or however often I send the thing. So this is a cumulative graph. This would be the end of the season. And I tried to color code them a little bit based on their self-reporting. Is your sugar bush about the same temperature as the ones around you? Or is it generally warmer than those around you or generally colder? Okay, not meant for rigorous analysis, really just kind of trying to see if there's any patterns. And what I saw was that this warm weather that showed up in the middle of March, it really started to be an inflection point where the ones who had generally warmer weather or warmer sugar bushes never really recovered when the cold weather came back. So here we had this really high temperature event and we produced a little bit, but the trend as far as the warmer bushes never really recovered. We had cold weather arrive again. We had snow later in the spring before the end of the season. Those bigger, colder, not bigger, but those colder locations tended to increase production as you would expect. These warmer ones were pretty much done. Let's see. The other thing that we've seen in terms of scale of operations is the use of what's called membrane concentration. That's RO. And I tie this in just because we talked about yields and different sized operations, but membrane concentration allows the pre-concentration of sap. So if it comes out of the tree around 2% sugar, you can force it through this membrane and pre-concentrate. You can take about 75 to 80% of the water out before you have to boil. Boiling water is very expensive, very time consuming, very energy intensive. It used to be really just for the largest operations because the equipment was quite expensive. We found that even small operations, this is some survey work we did with maple producers, even the smallest operations are adopting it. It's allowing even small operations, if they run their business with some thought about costs, they can do pretty well even on a small scale using this RO technology. I would estimate that, again, not of the total number of producers, but of the total number of the crop, it's easily 95% or more of the syrup that you would consume comes from syrup that's been, or sap that's been pre-concentrated. It's just, there's no other efficiency even close in terms of making the cost of producing syrup. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit, talk plants again, and talk a little bit about how we harvest this sap. So again, we're talking dormant trees. We're talking about drilling into the xylem tissue of the stem of these dormant trees. You can, if you're familiar with the anatomy at all, we've got fibers, we've got xylem vessels. These are the ray parenchyma cells that have been dyed with iodine, so they're dark because they're loaded with starch. But we're drilling into this xylem tissue and we're exposing some of these relatively large vessels, okay? Once we expose that tap hole, even though it's cold and doesn't seem like anything's really happening, you have now opened up that plant to the environment. So all the bacteria, yeast, mold, everything that's in the environment always now has a pathway into the plant. And that has really important ramifications in terms of production in any given year and the long-term sustainability of tapping. We know you have to make a new hole every year because the tree has a natural wound response system. Zoomed out again, we see the effect of that wound response system by these areas of non-conductive wood that get established by the tree. This is commonly known as compartmentalization, and it's both an active and a passive process. The passive part is the fact that the anatomy of this tissue does not allow for infection in all directions equally. In other words, these large vessels that are highly engineered and designed to move water with high volumes and throughout the growing season, this is a harder thing for the tree to shut down and wall off. It's much easier for the tree to prevent infection in other directions. And again, that is owing to the anatomy of the wood, but also the active part is the tree converting some of those non-structural carbohydrates into protective compounds to also allow for, to prevent against a widespread infection in the tree. So we talk about wood, non-conductive wood in terms of this stained area. It's also heartwood would be another example of non-conductive wood. And then conductive wood would be the clean, unstained xylem tissue. You have to make a new hole every year because the tree produces a new area of non-conductive wood as a result of that tapping every year. Now, sugar makers don't have X-ray vision. They can't look into the tree and see where those wounds are. Kind of the best evidence they have is looking at the tap hole and looking at the chips that come out of that tap hole every year. If you're really looking for light cream colored chips, which would represent you hitting just conductive wood, you hit brown wood, you've obviously hit something that's decayed, or at least rendered non-conductive. If a sugar maker saw only brown, they would likely abandon that tree or try to find a new area. Like I said, they don't have the benefit of seeing those stained areas. This was actually a sugar maker who made this great display where the top of this otherwise healthy tree broke off in a ice storm or something. And he whittled it down, put it on a lathe, did all these amazing things to show the orientation and the extent of that non-conductive wood. What's important to remember is moving it around, these all look fairly uniform, but I want to share some data in a minute to suggest they're not. They do orient themselves roughly vertically, but anyone who's worked with wood before knows the grain is not always perfectly straight and clear. And so the staining will likely follow that path. A few years ago, I did a project trying to understand what happens in terms of yield if you were to hit into some of this stained wood accidentally. So I took some trees up at the Proctor Center, tapped them intentionally into that non-conductive wood, and then some other trees I tapped intentionally into clean wood. And then on an individual tree basis, looked at volume of sap collected, the sweetness of the sap, and also the amount of non-conductive wood from the tap hole. So it was actually this kind of goofy little plastic apron I had, and I drilled the tree and collected the chips and sorted them. And it was definitely nothing that a sugar maker would do, but it does allow you to take a picture like this, where this would be an example of one of the trees where I drilled in through the bark, a little bit of conductive wood, and then the rest being non-conductive. And then this would have been one of the control trees where it was all conductive wood. Compiling all those trees and looking at the averages, I was able to see a trend like this. Probably not that surprising, but the greater amount of non-conductive wood you intercept with your tap hole, the less syrup equivalent you produce, less sap that comes out. Interestingly, the sap sweetness was not different. So the y-axis represents sap volume and sap sweetness combined to make a syrup equivalent. The sap sweetness was the same, whether or not you hit any brown wood or not, which I thought was sort of interesting result. So avoiding stained wood is really important. I will share that before or after doing this work, our colleague, Dr. Vandenberg, did some really interesting work looking at, I go back to this picture, what is the average size of this three-dimensional stained wood? So she did a lot of really interesting work, cutting some trees down, tapping them, cutting them down, doing some really precise image analysis, and coming up with a three-dimensional volume for that staining column. So keep this picture in your mind, all right? Her results showed that on average, if you take the three-dimensional volume of a tap hole, so the drill bit in and out, that cylinder that you've now created, the proportion of stained wood relative to that three-dimensional volume on average is 49.2 times. So the average staining is about 50 times the hole you just created with the tap hole or with the bit. But look at the range. It can be almost 200 times on certain individuals, or as few as like 15 times. And there's no way from the outside of knowing what you have. If you have one that's really good at compartmentalizing or one that is struggling. Yeah.
So is that the non-conductive wood per tap hole then?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
so it's linked to the volume of the tap hole.
That tap
Yeah,
hole itself.
yeah.
Yep. Really interesting work, really has implications in terms of what's the probability of hitting stained wood, even if you're doing best practices, what's the likelihood? Again, you don't know from the outside. There are some indications, open tap holes, that sort of thing, but there's a lot of variability. Yeah. So,
Is there a difference between the amount of non-conductive wood when you have, does it depend on whether there's a tap in it, or is it just drilling the hole
just
itself?
drilling the hole.
So you get the same results whether or not there was a tap in it.
Oh, well, she did not actually look at that, but functionally, we know that once the tree starts to wall that off, I don't have a picture here, but it's functionally, it's once that barrier is produced, there really isn't any difference to the tree. Yeah, and we have trees that unfortunately the tap holes have not been taken out. The trees have not been taken out, and the tree does not make a larger wound as a result. So, yeah, a lot of variability though. So, how to turn this into best practices is challenging because you're talking, you'll say, talking about that folk wisdom idea. You'll hear a lot of recommendations if you're looking to learn how to tap trees. Go over 2 inches and up 8 inches, or go over 6 and go down 12. That alone would suggest that there's a uniform amount of staining, and that staining is in a uniform orientation, and we know it's not. So unfortunately, we don't have a good recommendation. In practice, what we say is go as far away from the previous year's tap hole as possible, while still taking in everything else. If there's an open wound, if there's some other obvious dieback in the crown, try to take in the whole picture rather than just thinking about it as a perfect cylinder, because the trees are definitely not perfect cylinders. Yeah.
How much do you think that kind of vertical pattern of staining is, isolated to the Acer genus versus among other types of woody species?
I think because most trees have that type of anatomy where the vessels are quite large, they're designed for pumping water during the growing season. I think you're going to see that orientation. Sugar maple especially is thought of as being a really strong compartmentalizer. Other species are not. And so you could have the same diameter drill bit in a different tree, maybe like a poplar or something, no offense. That may not be as good at preventing that systemic infection as maybe a species like sugar maple. Okay, so I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about syrup quality. Again, maple is these crazy mix of dormant plants and temperature fluctuations and exposing xylem tissue and all these things that happen in the woods and all the stresses involved in growing healthy trees. And then you go in this building and you start making this high quality food. So this might seem like a little bit of a jarring switch to a non-maple audience, because maple audience, historically, they're doing everything. They're doing the careful forest management. They're doing the infrastructure of how to harvest the sap from the trees. And they're in the sugar house making that conversion. But apologies if it feels like a little bit of a hard shift there. Before I move on though, are there any questions more about the wood side of things? Yeah.
Is there, if you're managing a forest, are there any indicators for what trees you might want to keep or take out?
In terms of if you're really focused on maximizing sap production,
Yeah.
perhaps. So that's an interesting question. And there is sort of a legacy of managing for the widest crown, largest diameter tree. And there's even some historical documents that are still in circulation that would argue very low number of trees per acre, maximize diameter, maximize crown size to increase sap sweetness and sap volume from that tree. A lot of that, I would argue, is rooted in the fact that those recommendations came about when we were harvesting sap in buckets. And do you want to go to 500 trees, or do you want to go to 250 or 150 trees? The fewer number of trees that you go to, the argument would be it's easier for collection and labor and productivity. Now that we use tubing and vacuum, it doesn't really matter as much. I mean, you certainly don't want to spend more money on infrastructure than you have to. We know from predecessors way back, including the founders of the Proctor Center, one of the founders, Fred Taylor, did a lot of work looking at the relationship between individual tree sap sweetness and over time. So if we were all trees in a sugar bush, his work over many years would suggest that we all have essentially a different position relative to each other in terms of our sweetness, even if from year to year, based on environmental and other factors, our numbers may rise and fall, our position relative to each other would not. That was really important in a time before reverse osmosis was being used. And so you could select for the sweetest trees at the expense of the ones that trying, but you're not the sweet. So we're gonna ask you not to be part of our sugar bush anymore. So that again has been sort of functionally removed as an issue because reverse osmosis can basically bring everything up to this higher concentration. So I would say it kind of comes down to the basics of a healthy tree, good architecture, so one that's not weak, it's not going to break off some obvious reason because of the branching, maybe some other obvious defects, and not rely on species necessarily. You know, there's a long tradition of excluding everything but sugar maple, which is problematic in terms of kind of the sustainability long term. And we know that monocultures are not as resilient to stress as others. So the ability to tap other species, I'm going to get into it. Well, maybe no, I will get into it at the very end. But yeah, and this is also a pitch for more people looking at this, because there really hasn't been a really comprehensive look at the management of a sugar bush in the modern sense of how maple is produced. I don't know if that totally answered your question, but it's not like one tree is obvious that you would take out as compared to another, unless it was something that was really visible. Okay, we'll come back to this a little bit at the very end. I do have a couple of slides on the forestry side to finish on. Syrup quality. So syrup is graded on 4 standards: color, clarity, density, and flavor. Some of these are quantitative measures, and some of them are very subjective and rely on just sort of an accumulated understanding and agreement on what is and what isn't specifically flavor, what is good flavor and what is not good flavor. And I will put in a pitch after this talk. I do have some syrup in the office you guys can taste. And I'm not going to tell you anything about it. I'm just going to have you taste it, and we can talk about differences if you're interested. Cool. So I've produced some little cards to help people think about these basic differences. But in order for syrup to be in a retail container and graded grade A, the stuff you would buy in the bookstore or elsewhere, it has to meet the standard in these 4 attributes. Okay? And whoever's name is on the bottle is the one who's responsible that it meets those standards. So that's really important. It's not just UVM, Proctor Maple Research Center, UVM Extension saying it. There are regulations, and they do have to be followed too. You know, customer understanding of what pure maple syrup, it's a little thin, maybe not the most discerning. So some defects may not be seen as a big deal, but the regulations exist for a reason. High quality product, expensive product, and anyone, even if you're a backyarder, if you're selling your syrup, you really need to be beholden to these regulations. So I've been working on this through various means, presentations to sugar makers, doing testing in the marketplace, working with regulators who do testing, and share some results of that. So the Vermont Agency of Ag, Food and Markets is the state agency responsible for compliance with those regulations at the state level. This is one of the inspectors, Tucker, going out to a retail establishment, measuring those 4 attributes: color, clarity, density, and flavor. They do this every year. This past year, we found that 73% of the samples were in compliance, meaning that met all those 4 standards. So that means what, 32%, 27% do not. There were issues with flavor, including musty flavored and buddy flavored syrup. And this is very similar to the research we've been doing buying syrup on the online marketplace. So this is a project funded through the USDA. I've been partnering with Mark Canella, who's a farm business specialist with UVM Extension, purchasing syrup in the marketplace, Vermont and elsewhere, and also testing it for the basics of color, clarity, density, and flavor. Really just seeing what's the status, what's out there in the marketplace. I'm not going to go through all the results, but I will share that this past year, 2023, we found that only 26% of the samples in the category golden delicate met the color standard. So the rest were too dark for the grade. That may not seem like a big deal. And in reality, it doesn't really change the quality that much. But again, there are quantitative measures, didn't meet the target, and that we then share with the industry and say, okay, there's issues out there. And we know that syrup darkens over time, especially if it's stored in a plastic container. That plastic container is somewhat porous to oxygen, and you'll get some darkening over time. We know pretty well the rate of that. Interestingly, the dark samples, this is the grade dark robust, far more were within grade for color there. Interesting, not sure why, but they do tend to darken at the same rate, so hard to say. Also wanted to share some results on flavor of these samples. We found that just under 10% had some sort of defect in the golden category. Those flavors might be moldy, ferment, sour. I think we also had a metabolism. We talk about off flavors broadly as two big categories. We call Mother Nature off flavors, and these are things that happen due to the physiology of the tree or its response to the environment. The sap chemistry changes and it produces a syrup that isn't characteristic of the grade. So that's Mother Nature off flavors. They come and go. They're not predictable. They're not always the same intensity. Sometimes you can have combinations. So that's Mother Nature. And then processing mistakes would be, I forgot to open that valve and I burned my pans. And now my syrup has a burnt sugar scorch taste. That would be a processing mistake. Or I did a really good job cleaning my pans, but I used an inappropriate material like a Dawn dish soap, and now my syrup tastes like Dawn dish soap. or mothball syrup. Like I've had mothball syrup before, and it was a producer who uses cone filters, a cloth filter to filter with gravity, and they stored it in the off season in the blanket chest with the other things for the off season, including some mothballs. So otherwise good syrup flowed through that fabric and took on that flavor. So not great. There's a lot of infused syrup out there, but that's not one that.
What does buddy syrup taste like?
Yep. So you actually can have a chance to try it after if you want. Buddy syrup. That's a common term. It's not tied to some physiological stage, but it's essentially the tree exiting dormancy. We think that there's a lot of signaling going on, and that the chemistry of that sap, once you boil it down, it imparts. There's a bitterness to it. Sometimes people get like a Tootsie Roll chocolate type of flavor to it at a low concentration or a low intensity. It actually isn't terrible, but it doesn't fit the flavor description. So what this represents, this result represents syrup that either does meet the basic flavor or it doesn't. It's anything that failed to meet that basic flavor. And these Mother Nature off flavors don't come every year, and they don't come with the same intensity every year. So it can be hard to, there is some work being done elsewhere trying to do some testing of the sap to see if the precursors are there. It isn't quite ready, I don't think, for use yet, but there is some interest in it. But again, different operations have different costs of production. The defect, like if you make some, what we would call processing grade syrup, it still has value. It just can't be put into a grade A container. And so really over half the value of that syrup is just the fact that it's boiled down tree sap, maple syrup. It could be used in other products, like any other kind of product that doesn't have to be grade A. So lots of granolas and baking and dog treats and everything that doesn't have to be grade A to be used. Interestingly, when we look at the grade dark and the flavor results, quite a bit more defects in the dark. I would say this might reflect some opportunity for education, I'll put it that way, so that understanding that some of these late season flavors are actually defects. It's not just what the syrup made at the end of the season tastes like. And to be able to identify no, this actually is buddy, or this is a fermented sample versus just the very dark syrup. Definitely seeing the issues with in our work, pretty much across the board, issues with color on the lighter grades of syrup, issues of flavor with the darker grades of syrup.
Mark, how do you test for flavor? Just taste it.
That's one of those non-quantitative measures. So it's accumulated knowledge. It's a very thin language or very vague language in the regulations. And yeah, just experience. So I have a grant that I actually inherited from Abby after she left. It's looking at trying to adapt more rigorous sensory analysis techniques to determine where that line is between grade A and not grade A. So we have a trained flavor panel with Roy DeRocher, who's been helping Heather Darby, who's with Extension, trying to get at it. It's not a line. I mean, it's going to be like a zone, a zone of not grade A. But yeah, it's a tough one. Because even you could analyze, and we have, chemically analyze these samples and you see all these compounds that are not in these other ones. But that doesn't always equate to what a person will perceive in terms of flavor. And even a small amount of some chemical could have a really outsized impact on flavor compared to one that's more prevalent, but isn't really that objection. So, okay, real quick, I want to talk about some of the density results. In practice, most producers are going to use a hydrometer. This is a blurry zoomed in picture, I apologize. But a hydrometer is an instrument that works on displacement. So if you've ever done brewing or if you've done sugaring, you know you float this precisely weighted glass instrument in the liquid, and the amount of volume it displaces relative to a known standard. And temperature is very important. So the temperature of that liquid has a big part to play in how that hydrometer floats. This is by far the most common instrument used in sugaring, but unfortunately, it has its limitations. For one, it's an imprecise instrument, and it's also something that allows, let's see, how do I want to say this? It's being used because it's able to be used at high temperatures. So sugar makers use it right off the evaporator, hot syrup coming off the evaporator, they'll use the hydrometer to float in that syrup. What perhaps isn't well known is how rapidly temperature drops when it comes off the evaporator. And even a small amount of temperature difference is going to change how that hydrometer floats. We've known this for a long time, but when we look at the results, well, before I get there, so even more zoomed in picture, but what I want to say is the precision of these instruments, the most common one, is whole degrees Brix. Brix is the unit of measure. It's percent sucrose in a pure sucrose solution. It's not perfect for maple because we have other things in there, but it's close enough. So this would be 65 Brix, so 65% sugar roughly. This would be 66, 67. So the precision of those hydrometers is 1 whole degree Brix. The legal standard in Vermont, the whole range is only essentially 2 degrees Brix. So sugar makers, because of the way these instruments are designed and the precision that they're engineered for, they literally have to read between the lines if they want to try to estimate density. And then you add on top foam, you get steam, being tired, all these things can impact the accuracy of the reading. When we look at defects, and we do find issues of defects, we overwhelmingly find issues on the low end. So you explain this table a little bit. These are 2 different years of data. This is of the syrup that we found was out of range for density. How many were below and how many were above the legal range? And since Vermont has a higher lower limit than the US, I have a separate row for that. But you can see overwhelmingly, if there's going to be an issue in density, it's going to be on the low end. Like the syrup was not dense enough when we tested it. And that's likely tied to the fact that most producers use hydrometers and they use it at high temperatures. There's something called the hot test line. It's the line that people shoot for. But that line represents the absolute lower limit of legal density syrup. So they don't have any wiggle room on the low end. Rather than shooting to the middle of the legal range, they shoot to the low end, either knowingly or unknowingly. And when we see results that are not at all balanced, we realize it's probably an issue of temperature, just not accurately measuring the temperature of the syrup that hydrometer is floating in. Like I said, this is not new news. This is a quote from the 1960s, a producer's manual, and it's not ideal, but it is what we have for instrumentation.
Mark, how would a hydrometer compare to a refractometer?
So a refractometer measures the angle that light bends as it moves through a liquid, and it can be very effective and very precise. It's not good with hot temperature liquids. Even temperature compensated refractometers, they have a range that they can manage, and it just is impractical at the time of production. And whether it's a good idea or not, tradition would have that producers are measuring their syrup density right at the point of production. We use refractometers all the time, but with room temperature syrup. Any other questions on that?
It's just kind of related to this generally. I was curious, you kind of clued in on this, I think, a little bit a second ago, with density and with flavor and especially with color. There seems to be a bias. Some of it's methodological in this case, with people missing the mark, or maybe how much of this is, do you think, or do you have a sense of being intentional misrepresentation of color, for example, or if people just have no idea what the standard really is?
I don't think it's intentional. I think the color one, especially since we know that syrup darkens over time, especially once it's packaged into a plastic container. I think it's probably a lack of awareness of how rapidly that can happen. There's still some work we need to do about the impact of how much headspace is left, how much oxygen is actually just left in there when the cap is on, because there's no oxygen barrier there.
Sure.
And so you'll get darkening happening. No, I don't think, and the other thing is that it used to be, there was a time when lighter grade syrup was actually more expensive. Producers were paid more for it, consumers paid more for it. That's gone away. And you basically pay the same price regardless of color. And so there's no financial incentive to be.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering if
misrepresented.
maybe there was like a leftover sense of quality or prestige of lighter.
There's probably some of that. There's probably some of that. I don't think it's super widespread. I think it's probably an awareness thing. Maybe you get into a habit of doing a certain thing and you don't get the feedback too, until you get some feedback indicating, well, maybe your practices aren't working as well. And this is a side note. I don't have a slide on it, but you can still find in 2024, you can still find retail packaging for syrup that says, if you were to find mold on the surface of your syrup, scrape it off, reboil, and you can bring it back. We don't recommend that anymore.
I have that on a bottle at home.
Yeah, that is not rooted in food safety. It's not rooted in science. If you leave with nothing else, just know that you should contact the producer, say, I have mold in my syrup. Now that there is one caveat with that though. If you open your syrup and leave it on your counter, now it's on you. But if you have an unopened container and you open it and the first thing you see is mold, that there's likely a sanitation issue somewhere in the processing of that syrup. But we do not recommend that anymore. You may kill the spores, but whatever mycotoxins or whatever that fungus is produced, that is not going to get impacted by 219 degrees Fahrenheit. So we cannot recommend that anymore.
Yeah, very cool.
Yep, there's a question.
Are there any issues in the maple industry around like misrepresenting the place of origin or having to like other states representing it as Vermont maple?
So that's not something that I focus on too much. That definitely falls within the Agency of Ag. So the Agency of Ag does all the regulations, labeling, all that stuff. I would say there's always going to be some risk because you can't see what everyone's putting into a container. I haven't seen a very current report on the extent of it. I don't think it is very common.
Yeah, I didn't know if the agency that I was testing for that or.
Well, there's no way for them to really test the
Right.
syrup to say it came from Vermont versus elsewhere. It would really be a paperwork type thing. But they are the agency that's empowered to enforce that. And the regulations do make it very clear. If you have Vermont maple syrup on your container, and that includes if your business name implies you're from Vermont. So, it could be, Vermont Acres, but from some other state, that would be probably flagged once they heard about it.
I would think the bigger problem would be diluting or mixing it with some cheap sugar syrup and then selling it as maple. I think, wouldn't that be more?
Yeah, did everyone hear Jean's comment that the issue of adulteration, we would call that with less expensive sweeteners? That has been documented, and luckily, the sugars that you would most likely use fix carbon in a different way, and you can look at the ratio of how carbon was fixed versus like a grass versus a tree, and that can be detected. A lot of times you don't even have to get to that step. Like the people who do it tend to be sloppy and they price it so low that they just draw their attention and it's pretty obvious. But that testing does exist, and some of that work was done here at UVM. We don't do that current testing now, but we definitely will field questions about it. I'm right at 1 or 2 o'clock, so I'm going to end. I have a few more slides, but it just isn't going to be time to go through it. But I really appreciate the questions. I thought it was a good discussion, so I'm glad we got to do that. If you have questions in the future, or if you get interested in maple and want to follow up, please reach out. Be happy to put you in touch with folks or talk about what your idea might be and how we might. So if you want to taste some syrup, I'll go into the office and we can set some samples up. Otherwise, have a great day.
Let's thank Mark.